Welcome to SIR Studios, Inside the Issue. I'm Casey Pycior, fiction editor of Southern Indiana Review. Inside the Issue is a new interview series where I'll be talking with fiction contributors whose work appears in SIR. Today's guest is Hannah Thurman, whose story Thin Skin is featured in the fall 2023 issue. Hannah Thurman is a Brooklyn-based writer originally from Raleigh, North Carolina. She won the Florida Review's 2023 Editor's Prize in Fiction, and her short stories have been published or are forthcoming in the Iowa Review, Michigan Quarterly Review, the Brooklyn Rail, and Meridian, among many others. She's had residencies at Yaddo, Loaf, Vermont Studio Center, and the Virginia Center for Creative Arts. Hannah, welcome to Inside the Issue.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. This is a new thing here, and we're hoping to kind of make something cool out of it. So maybe to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about your story, Thin Skin? Maybe a little bit about it and kind of where the story, even the genesis of the story, or where the idea came from, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. So I actually started this short story in 2017. I know you were listing those residencies, and some of them have been a while since I went. And I was at Vermont Studio Center then and had this idea for this story about someone who, is not a teenager, someone who's in like kind of their late 20s and still is having this like intense like cystic acne and going through this process of trying to get her skin cleared up, medically, and also like what then this, kind of perception of beauty is within her own life as her exterior changes. And so I actually, I started the story like way back when, put it aside for, a couple of years and just kind of got back into it. I think in, I think it was like 2 years ago, maybe, because I had this idea and, I was like, okay, it's this thing about, beauty and like the perception of, like femininity and all these different kinds of ideas, but it didn't really like clarify to me how the story was going to go until I got back into it. And so, early on, I had this character surrounded by a couple of different people and, the different ways that they intersected with her life. And I think like kind of the biggest first change that I made to get the story into the way that it is right now is I condensed a lot of the characters into one. So it kind of became, this character versus like, a bunch of people around her to this character with, one other singular person. And this is her roommate and best friend who is coincidentally about to get married and kind of like go off into this own kind of different adult life, that she herself is not, kind of really ready for. So anyway, that kind of long circuitous road led to some edits that I made to, have these characters face more kind of like oppositionally and got us into the story as it is now.
That's really cool. So GK is the character that was many characters and got moved down to one.
Yeah, she was just one of them. And so her name is GK, which is like this kind of inside joke within the characters. Her name is Kyle. And, the joke is that growing up, she was like girl Kyle to differentiate from the others. Well, there used to be an actual Kyle. Like that was one of the other like people that got cut. As I was like, oh, you got a couple of roommates and one's Kyle and one's girl Kyle. So RIP to boy of Kyle, but girl Kyle remained.
I'm always interested in stories that kind of start in one place and either we get stuck or things happen and we move on to something else, and kind of returning to those stories and finding something that was there that we didn't know was there. I think that's a really cool thing. Was the complicated / romantic relationship between the narrator and GK in the earlier draft?
No, it wasn't. And that was actually something I have rarely experienced this as a writer, but that was like an epiphany I had. Like I remember where I was in the library. I was in the teen section of the library because that's like the best place to write because teens don't like to come to our library. And I had just turned in this draft to my writing group that had this very fraught relationship with the main character and GK, and this kind of like codependence where the main character really doesn't want GK to move out. And my writing group was like, are they hooking up? And I was like, no, they're not. And like, people don't have to be like, sexually sexually, involved, to have like a close relationship. And so I was really fighting that. Meanwhile, I'm like telling this story where it's just like the end of the world, that this relationship is ending. And I was sitting there in the teen section of the library, and I was like, oh my God, I think they are having sex. So, but like to have characters sexually involved doesn't necessarily mean just one thing. And I did want it to be a little more complicated than, oh, she's like, secretly gay, but in the closet. Like I wanted her to have, a more complicated experience with sexuality, kind of like mediated by this other character. But yeah, that was not in it. And then it just burst into being.
Yeah. So just to clarify for people who have not read the story yet, in the final version of the story, GK is gay and she's getting married to another woman, and the narrator Julianne is, I read her as, well, you mentioned the word codependent. I think that's a really good word to use for, there's something that GK gives Julianne that she can't get anywhere else, but she's not yet sure, where she fits. Like if so I don't know. I thought that was handled really well. And I think that it's a fraught, complicated thing that feels, it feels authentic. It feels real, in like the best kind of way, that it doesn't sort of go down kind of easy lines, right? Where she doesn't have this sudden realization that she's been gay the whole time, and none of those things, which I think is to the story's betterment for sure. So was your process on this story similar to processes for previous stories? Like, do you find yourself coming back to stories later, or was this one unique? And when I say process, you don't have to be, I'm not asking like literal process, more like the composing of a story, the drafting of the story.
Yeah, this I do think was fairly unique among stories that I've written, in that it did take a number of years from start to finish. A lot of the time I think about maybe the most recent short story I wrote, which had a more typical timeline for me. I wrote it at a residency maybe 18 months ago, did the like typing up and like, looking at a first draft and looking at a second draft. And within about a year and a half had it ready to go, based on some areas of like setting it aside and having people look at it. So in that way, the process was very similar, in that, just thinking about like what I would want to do next, and, journaling to get to the next draft. But it did just, for whatever reason, have this kind of like period of time that I had left it alone, but I came back to it, which I think is also, it's pretty different, because I definitely have stories I've abandoned. But this one is one of the ones that like came fully into fruition, but just took, a while to get there.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think it's Andre Dubus said something about like, if he writes like 3 stories a year, he's happy.
Yeah.
When he was alive, and because he's like 3 stories a year, 2 or 3 stories a year over the course of 4 or 5 years, and you've got a collection worth of stories.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if I use that as like a, if you're not writing consistently, it's like, oh, it's okay. He said it was okay to only write 2 or 3. But it also, there's a quote I give my students, and I'm going to butcher this. I don't have it handy, but George Saunders said in an interview somewhere, talking about like basically how a story should take how long it needs to take. Because he says, what does he say? Like, something to the effect of like, why would you try to cheapen something that could be great? Like, every story you write, you have the opportunity to write something great. Why rush it? If it takes 5 years, it takes 5 years. That's a hard thing to hear for students when you say like, oh, you've got a workshop story due next week. But it's nice to hear. I like when we hear about a story where the writer took their time, right? Mm-hmm. The story wouldn't have been the story if you had pushed it, right? Yeah. Or it would be a different story, perhaps. And I don't know. I like that.
Yeah. And, I actually was just thinking about another part of this that I'd totally forgotten as I was talking about the story behind the story, which is, I actually think, so one of the things that delayed this story is I actually went out with it to, like, I submitted it to a bunch of publications, now I'm forgetting my own timeline, but in the last couple, maybe like 2 years ago, I started going out with it to publications and got a lot of enthusiasm, or at least, what passes for that in a lit mag, where they're like, oh, we really liked XYZ. And you're like, oh, this is not just a rote rejection. But no one would pick it up. And so I was talking to, one of my writing friends, and she was like, maybe it's too long. And she had, because actually I had the same thing happen to another short story of mine. They were both around 5,000 words. And she was like, I don't think people's attention span is that long anymore. So she was like, I challenge you to cut both of these stories down to 2,500 words if you can. And so I actually took both stories at the time and cut them down. And one of them stayed. And that was a different one that is getting published in the Florida Review in a bit. That one felt like I could get it to 2,500 words. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. This one, though, I cut down, and that actually was part of the process of revision, where then it like ballooned back up to 5,000. So anyway, that was interesting to me to see that, that process of winnowing it down, even if that ultimately was not where the story was, I do think got it to this better place.
So that's really cool. And I mean, as someone who reads a lot of fiction submissions,
Yeah.
I love the 2,500 word stories.
I'm so eager to ask you about that, because at the time I was like, is that BS? But I don't know.
No, I mean, there's no such thing as a story is as long as it needs to be. But I do find that we get, I mean, I don't have any numbers on this, but it feels anyway, and that's, what does that mean? But it feels anyway that we get way more stories in the 20 to 25 plus range. And when I come across one that's, 8 or 10 pages, it's like, it's just just refreshing, because just the time to read it is nice, but also those stories tend to, they get in and get out. They do, there's no opportunity for the narrative to kind of sag or get bogged down. That's really cool, though, that like thinking about what you winnowed out of this, what you cut from the story, I'm guessing probably revealed things that could be cut and left you with something that that maybe you knew needed to be expanded to tell the story, but you got rid of things that, I mean, I guess I'm saying as an exercise, it might be kind of cool. Just to see, like, it may not be a 2,500 word story, but the effort that might do something. That's kind of a cool idea.
Yeah. And it's so funny. I'd totally forgotten that was part of the process. I was like, oh, I just edited it all on my own, which I did edit it all on my own, but I had this thought that I was going to try to cut down. And yeah, there was this like, hanging out at trivia scene, like bar trivia. And that just didn't end up making it in. And then there was a whole kind of part of, both of these characters are teachers, and there was like a big preoccupation in the previous draft with money and like what, and especially as like, I guess this character is like 29. And I thought that was like an interesting, like cusp age where you're like, oh my God, I can't survive on being like quite as broke as I used to. And also like the difference between them and like the teenagers that they teach, and, being able to afford clothes that look nice, but also that make you feel, ethical, and they didn't come from sweatshops. Anyway, I had this whole thought about this, which I'm kind of like talking through now, which I still think is a really interesting part of it, but I think we just lost the focus for this story, which was becoming so much more about, this codependent relationship and just that part.
Yeah. A couple of things I wanted to just talk about that I really liked in the story. I think the voice, we're always here at SIR, we're always, like a lot of places, just a sucker for a voice. And I think the voice here, like the very first line, the nurse asked me to list my 2 forms of birth control. Abstinence, I tell her. Do I need another one? Like, that's funny, right? And but it's funny, but not like empty, right? It's not an empty joke. It does this pretty deep character work in that line gets a laugh and reveals something about this narrator before we know anything else about her at all. We don't know why she's visiting the nurse, any of that. So it's just, immediately we're in the story and wrapped in this voice, and the voice is funny is not the right word, and it's not snarky, it's not nothing like that. But there's just a kind of a bite to the voice and to Julianne's perspective, which I think is it's really nice. It also fits her being a teacher because she's around these, graduating teenagers, and they're, terrible in the way that they obviously are. She's dealing with that. It just fits in. And GK is even like more, I imagine she was probably a fun character to write because she's so kind of not over the top, but I don't know, how would you just, I'm gonna not over the top character, but she's pretty irreverent in spaces we wouldn't expect her to be, like this Catholic high school, for example.
And
And
I think there's something about her that is like an over dramatic, like she kind of plays up her own drama, especially when there are other people around her and Julianne. And I thought that was interesting too, that like she is speaking for an audience. She kind of like needs this audience. And I think that's kind of what like she needs from Julianne. So.
Well, yeah, there's a line somewhere. Well, on the manuscript page, the second page of the story, we've been doing this for years, playing caricatures of ourselves, dialing up our most extreme traits until we get a rise out of each other, which is what friends do, right? They're trying to push each other's buttons and embarrass each other and all of that. So I just thought that was handled really well. Then two other things. Broadly speaking, I think like the way you navigate Julianne's relationship to her acne and her face is really interesting because the acne is almost like a mask for her, right? She covers it with makeup, but goes through this process, and the reason she's at the doctor is to get this medication that will work to clear her face up, but it will have these side effects of being like incredibly dry skin and all of that. But like people start recognizing and commenting, and her and GK even kind of get into it about this, and she doesn't know what to do when she isn't the woman with the acne, I think is the way I'm reading it. It's a very kind of interesting, complicated in the best way, right? She gets this thing that she wants, but she doesn't like it. The thing she's always been wanting, she doesn't like it because she could kind of hide behind, like she doesn't put herself out there because she has this acne, but then kind of laments the fact that no one wants to be with her. But so anyway, I just thought that was handled really well throughout the story. I mean, do you have anything to say about that? I mean, just about how you navigated that space?
No, well, I'm glad it came across well. I mean, that really was the part of the very short book, the short story, that, stayed from the very beginning, like the question in my mind of like, when, if you've lived with something that is very, physically visible, like what happens when it goes away, and what part of this acne was just like her perception, and what was, and what was like this actual reality, because she does see people, like changing the way that they interact with her. So I mean, that was definitely the thread throughout that I wanted to continue and focus on.
Yeah, like I said, I think that works really, really well. Last thing I'll point to is this is more of it's something I liked in the story, of course, and also a question. So the ending of the story, not to totally give anything away, but the final image is really striking, and it does exactly what I want a story ending to do. But it has to do with these rocks that the students have been collecting because they read The Crucible. How, the times that I've stumbled upon things in my own writing like this are similar, and I think I'm right instinctually about this, but what was that like for you? Like, how did those rocks come in? Like, was it organic to the story, and then you realized, oh wait, I can come back to this? Or was it something that you had kind of planned, I guess, if that makes sense?
I think that was a part of the story, whether planned or unplanned, that was pretty consistent from its inception. Like, I would have to triple check that it was really in that like first draft that I wrote back in Vermont 5 years ago. But Yeah, it's funny. I think both the opening lines and that final image were pretty consistent. It was just like the meat of the story, how you get there. I had to figure out. Yeah, I mean, I do think like another theme of this story and why it was so difficult to wrap all these themes together is, this theme of, adolescence, suspended adolescence in Julianne's case, but also um that matched up against actual teenagers. And, because in some ways Julianne's like stuck in this rut, but like she is an adult. And these teenagers that she's teaching the crucible who are, coming to her with all these questions about, oh my God, this college, I like, did I get into the right college? Am I doing the right thing with my life? All of that, I think it functions well around an image of like one of the books she would be teaching. So yeah, I don't know how I necessarily picked like the rocks in the crucible. And this is like Giles Corey, who is famously crushed by rocks in the Salem witch trials. I don't know necessarily why I gravitated towards that over like, I don't know, the Scarlet Letter or anything else that you might think of for like, 11th, 12th grade curriculum. I do think it ended up being a really fitting metaphor about like kind of the like adolescent part of the story. And it was more an oblique reference to like all the stuff about beauty that, is more the focus throughout. So just kind of like a little twist at the end to focus on one of the more minor themes.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I guess I was wondering because it seems like those moments tend to, at least for me, when you're literally working on the story and you're like, oh, wait a minute,
Yeah.
I can do something, like I can bring this back at the end, and it felt very much like a moment because it didn't feel forced, I guess is what I'm saying. Like it wasn't like when we got to the rocks in the story, we're like, she's gonna come back to this at the end, which is exactly what we want, right? We want something to come back at the end that we didn't see coming, and then only in retrospect realize like, oh well, of course, right? And I think that idea of the weight, the pressure that the students are feeling, the pressure that Julianne's feeling, it's a striking image. Just on its own, it's a striking image, but the way it works in the story, I think is really, really nice. And I mean, it's no accident that the beginning is really, really strong, and the ending is, I mean, it's all strong throughout too, but there's something about stories that grab us right at the beginning, and do that, make some move at the end that makes it all worthwhile. That's what, it's so simple to talk about and so difficult to do. I know you were a little tight on time, so what are you working on now, if you don't mind, and like where might people find more of your work beyond what I talked about in your bio? Where might people find more of your work? And if you're interested in talking about what you're working on, kind of basically plug whatever you're into.
Yeah, sure. I mean, right now, in various edits of various stages, various lengths of projects, so that's probably not as exciting. But I do have a couple of short stories that are, they are all like kind of dropping at the same time. And I'll have one coming out in the Iowa Review, I think this winter. Like I just got the proof, so it seems like it should be pretty soon. That one's called Agency. And as you mentioned at the beginning, I won the Florida Review's fiction prize. And that I think is also happening fairly recently at the end of, recently in terms of literary publishing, which is,
next year.
anytime in the next 6 months. So the next issue of the Iowa Review, the next issue of the Florida Review, and of course, the Southern Indiana Review. So yeah, those will be the next places you can see my work. I've got a website, hannahthurman.com, and that has links to some of my other pieces. So yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I will post your bio and the website link in the description below so people can have an easy access to check that out. And if you're interested in finding Thin Skin, like as I said, it's in the fall issue of the fall 23 issue of SIR, and you can go to usi.edu/SIR to find out how to get a copy or to subscribe. And the links of all that will be in the description as well. Thank you again, Hannah. It was wonderful talking with you. Yeah, we'll see everybody on the next one.
Awesome. Bye.